Beneath Nebraska's quiet hills and endless grass, something refuses to stay buried. Bonebeds where nothing should have died. Volcanoes that never erupted. Rivers that ran uphill, then vanished. Science has explanations, just not good ones. These are the pre-flood mysteries of Nebraska, before history, before memory, before the map. And they still won't explain themselves. Before we start digging too deep, hit that subscribe button if you're into mysteries that don't come with neat endings. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because if you're listening to this in the middle of the night, well, you're exactly who this was made for. 1. Indian cave petroglyphs. They don't scream. They don't warn. They just watch. Carved into the soft sandstone wall of a bluff overlooking the Missouri River, the figures at Indian Cave State Park do something more unnerving than shout. They persist. They outlast, silent, unmoving, and completely uninterested in explaining themselves. For over a century, archaeologists, hikers, park rangers, and the occasional overconfident grad student have stared at these faint, fading petroglyphs and asked the same question. Who carved these, and when? The short answer, we still don't know. Indian Cave's petroglyphs are etched into a rock face in the southeastern corner of Nebraska, where the bluffs drop into the floodplain like someone pulled back the earth's skin. The carvings themselves, mostly of animals, human-like figures, and some geometric motifs, are barely visible in direct sunlight. Catch them at the wrong time of day, and they disappear entirely. Catch them at dusk, though, and they start to emerge, as if they're waiting for the sun to leave before they speak. For decades, state park brochures and local signage have presented the carvings as the handiwork of indigenous people, made hundreds or possibly thousands of years ago. But here's the uncomfortable part. No one knows which group. No one knows when. And no one knows why. The sandstone itself doesn't help. It's friable, meaning it crumbles easily, which is great for carving but terrible for dating. There are no organic pigments, no charcoal outlines, no helpful little inscriptions that say made by woodland culture 600 AD. Just rocks scraped by something sharp. Lichens have grown over some figures. Others have eroded to shadows. Every time someone tries to clean or stabilize the surface, preservationists argue whether we're saving the past or scrubbing it away. Some of the carvings show animals, possibly bison or deer. Others show humanoid shapes with extended arms. One looks vaguely like a figure holding a shield. But even interpreting the shapes feels like walking into a Rorschach test blindfolded. To make matters worse, amateur etchings from early tourists, names, initials, dates are intermixed with the originals. Somewhere between 1860 and 1920, the bluff face became a social media wall for anyone with a penknife. That 19th century graffiti now complicates any attempt at archaeological clarity. You can carbon date organic residue, but you can't carbon date ignorance. Attempts to trace the petroglyphs to a specific culture, Pali or Indian, archaic, woodland, even historic tribes like the Otoe or Omaha have hit a wall. Literally. Because without excavation or associated artifacts, the carvings float in temporal limbo. They could be 200 years old. They could be 2,000. The site lacks clear stratigraphy, context, or any friendly clues. Just the uncanny feeling that someone, long ago, wanted to be remembered, but not understood. And maybe that's the point. What if the purpose of these petroglyphs wasn't communication but encryption? Not to inform the future, but to resist it. To persist, yes, but also to withhold. We assume the past wants to be read like a textbook. But what if some parts of it were meant to be legible? Not lost, but locked. Of course, that theory won't help the archaeologists, or the historical markers, or the weekend visitors squinting through their phone cameras trying to capture something older than memory. And yet, the carvings remain. Anonymous, ambiguous, absurdly stubborn. Maybe that's why the next mystery feels so familiar. It's also carved into the landscape, layered by hand over generations. But instead of a single wall of rock, it's an entire hill, one that keeps drawing people in, century after century, even though no one can quite agree why. 2. Signal Butte's long layered story out on the plains where the land folds like an old bedsheet, greased, frayed, and sun-bleached. There rises a solitary mound called Signal Butte. To the untrained eye, it's just another sandstone promontory, one of many in Nebraska's western panhandle. But Signal Butte doesn't just sit in the landscape, it lingers in it. It has layers. Not just geological, but human. Layers of occupation, layers of mystery, layers of purpose no one can quite agree on. You'd think a hill wouldn't cause this much trouble. And yet for over a century, Signal Butte has remained one of the most enigmatic archaeological puzzles on the Central Plains. From the moment it was first tested in the 1930s, excavators knew something was off. This wasn't just a one-time campsite. This wasn't a fluke of coincidence or convenience. This was deliberate, repeated, centuries apart. People kept coming back here, and no one knows why. On its surface, Signal Butte is strategically placed. A sentinel over the valley floor, it offers panoramic views in every direction. That's the obvious theory. It was a lookout point, a signaling station, maybe even a ceremonial space. A place to watch, to wait, to be seen. But start digging, literally, and the story becomes weirder. Excavations reveal distinct occupational layers spanning thousands of years. Paleo-Indian tools, archaic period artifacts, and even late prehistoric remnants all stacked like chapters in a badly translated novel. The bottom layers, dating possibly to 8000 BC, hold deeply buried hearths and flake stone points associated with some of the continent's earliest inhabitants. Above them lie archaic components with groundstone tools and different lithic technologies. Then much higher in the stack are remains tied to later Plains village groups. This isn't typical. Most sites in Nebraska are either single component or show occupation at intervals so wide and scattered that overlap is accidental. But at Signal Butte, the use was persistent and focused, as if the hill itself were a magnet or a message. So here comes the question no one has answered. why Signal Butte? Why would completely different cultures across time choose this same rocky outcrop to camp, build fires, and shape tools? Was it geography alone, its elevation, visibility, wind shelter, or was there a symbolic pull, some echo that kept drawing people back even after the original meaning had faded? Some archaeologists have proposed that the butte served as a kind of memory site, a landscape feature imbued with ancestral significance. Others suggest practical reasons. The butte overlooks seasonal game trails, and its exposed rock could offer usable raw materials. But none of these theories fully explain the continuity, because there's a deeper tension here. The tools and artifacts suggest change, technological shifts, cultural evolution. But the location suggests continuity. That paradox, difference within sameness, is what makes Signal Butte more than a curiosity. It becomes a contradiction. And that contradiction deepens when we consider that most of the site's original archaeological data is now gone, lost to early 20th century excavation methods, which prioritize collection over context. Artifacts were removed, layers were jumbled, notes were sparse. As a result, modern researchers trying to reconstruct the sequence of occupation are left with puzzle pieces from multiple boxes and no picture on the lead. So now, Signal Butte stands as a monument not just to ancient people, but to the limits of knowing. A geological palimpsest that holds stories, secrets, and probably a few errors. But while Signal Butte's layers confuse with their continuity, the next mystery flips the script. It's not about the same place being used by different people. It's about the same place being used again and again by different hands. And whether they ever even knew each other existed. And at the center of that story is a cave. One where time runs not in a straight line but in stratified whispers. Strange how the same hill can hold 1,000 years of stories and still say nothing at all. If you're the kind of person who listens for what the land won't tell you, go ahead and subscribe. And since we're already trading in deep time, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it where you are? Midnight? Noon? Either way, you're right on schedule. 3. Ash Hollow Caves cultural handoffs. Some places wear their history on the surface. Ash Hollow is not one of them. Tucked beneath the lip of a canyon wall in western Nebraska, Ash Hollow Cave is a shallow, unassuming rock shelter. More shadow than structure, more hollow than cave. At a glance, it looks like the kind of place you'd stop to rest for a moment before moving on. And yet, people didn't just rest here. They stayed. Over and over. For more than 6,000 years. The deeper archaeologists dug, the more complicated things became. Not because of what they found, but because of who left it. Ash Hollow Cave isn't a snapshot of one time period. It's a long exposure photo of human occupation in slow motion. Layers of cultural debris, charcoal, bone fragments, chipped stone, and burned seeds accumulated inch by inch, generation by generation, until the floor of the cave became a timeline, one you can stand inside. But here's the twist. While the evidence is clear that many groups came through, it's less clear how or whether they were connected. The cave became a kind of pass the baton relay across the millennia, with each group leaving their mark, only to vanish without explanation. One layer reveals a toolkit typical of the late Archaic period: expedient flakes, grinding stones, bone awls. Just above it, projectile points shift toward what we'd call woodland styles. Later still, fragments of pottery appear, coils, rims, and grog-tempered shirts that speak to Plains village life ways. Each horizon tells a new story, but the transitions, they're silent. There's no smoking gun, no ceremonial marker announcing a cultural shift, no friendly note that says, "New tenants, same view." Just changes in material style, subsistence focus, and technology that may or may not reflect migration, assimilation, or slow evolution. Archaeologists are left with a riddle. Were these groups part of a continuous line, passing knowledge hand to hand like family heirlooms? Or did they replace one another, each finding the cave again for the first time, like a scratched-out chapter rewritten by a different author? The evidence, like the sediment, is mixed. Some layers show signs of long-term occupation, intact hearths, dense food remains, reused stone tools. Others are thinner, almost ghostly, suggesting brief stops or seasonal visits. It's as if the cave itself was a kind of constant while the world changed around it. A refuge during drought, a lookout during migration, a way station between bigger destinations, but always returned to, always reoccupied. And then there's the geographic tension. Ash Hollow Cave isn't in an urban center of prehistoric Nebraska. It's remote, perched at the intersection of water, shelter, and visibility, a practical spot, but also a liminal one. It sits where the high plains start to crumble into canyons, where prairie gives way to stone. Not quite one thing or another. That liminality might be the only constant. The cave seems to have drawn people not just because it was useful, but because it stood on a threshold, between biomes, between eras, between cultures. A place to pause and reset, or maybe a place to leave things behind. And one thing someone may have left behind was fire. A layer deep in the cave's floor bears the blackened remains of something unnatural for its age. Charred material, dated tentatively to a time long before pottery, long before villages, long before we thought people here even knew fire could be used in this way. So the question is, who lit that fire? And what were they burning for? Very early fire at Ash Hollow. Ash Hollow burns, but quietly. Deep beneath the layers of broken bone, scattered stone, and drifting time, archaeologists found something strange. Something blackened. Something buried. A thin lens of charred organic material pressed into the floor of Ash Hollow Cave. Silent testimony to a fire that should not have been there, or rather, should not have been there then. The radiocarbon date, if it holds, pushes the origin of that burn layer back to around 8000 BC, during what we call the early Holocene. In other words, the dawn of settled life, long before agriculture reached these plains, before ceramic vessels, before bows and arrows, before even the concept of plains cultures had begun to take shape. If the date is accurate, this is one of the oldest known uses of fire by human hands in Nebraska. Possibly the oldest localized fire feature west of the Missouri in the state. It's not just a campfire. It's a flare across the archaeological timeline saying, we were here. Not just passing through, not just lost, here and doing something intentional. But what? Fire, of course, is not an unusual find in archaeological sites. It's one of the most basic and transformative tools in human history. Cooking. Warmth, protection. Yes. But it's also a message, a sign of control over the environment, of planned occupation. A fire tells you that someone expected to stay even for a little while. So why does this particular fire matter so much? Because it shouldn't be here. Or at least not in this context. Most interpretations of Great Plains prehistory treat the early Hollow scene as a time of highly mobile bands. Paleo-Indians chasing megafauna across a drying continent, constantly moving, rarely settling. The assumption is that sites from this era should be ephemeral. Few flakes here, a butchered bone there. Certainly nothing resembling permanence. And yet, at Ash Hollow, we find not just a fire pit, but a fire pit buried deep beneath later, more complex cultural layers, as if it were the foundation stone in a structure we didn't realize had a basement. Some researchers have questioned the date. Could the charcoal have migrated downward from a more recent occupation? Could the stratigraphy have been disturbed by rodents, roots, or erosion? Could the test sample have been contaminated? Yes. All of that is possible. And yet, the layer appears undisturbed. The burn is consistent. The charcoal is concentrated. The soil above and below suggests minimal mixing. In short, it looks legitimate, which forces a new, more unsettling possibility into the discussion. What if people were here, using fire regularly, organizing their lives around it far earlier than we thought? It challenges the existing timeline of habitation in the region. It forces us to reconsider what the early Holocene really looked like in Nebraska, not just a windswept plain of big game hunters, but a place where someone knew this cave, gathered wood, knelt at the hearth, and left behind a moment of heat in the geological cold. But even if we accept the fire's age, we still don't know who lit it. There are no associated tools in that layer. No bones, no ornaments, just blackened ash, like punctuation with no sentence. Whoever they were, they came and went like smoke, leaving behind only the evidence of their warmth and none of their names. And that brings us to another strange presence in prehistoric Nebraska, a place where identities aren't just buried but blended, where stone tools from different traditions overlap in the same valley and the borders between groups blur like footprints in river mud. In other words, we're heading into a borderland, one that isn't drawn on any map but still separates something important. 5. Medicine Creek as a Paleo-Indian borderland. At first glance, Medicine Creek doesn't look like the kind of place to cause disciplinary arguments. It's a modest tributary that winds through the rolling hills and sediment-stuffed valleys of south-central Nebraska, eventually feeding into the Republican River. Today, its banks are mostly quiet, fringed with cottonwoods, interrupted by the occasional farmstead and traced by dusty county roads that don't go anywhere in a hurry. But underneath that rural calm, lies one of the most intellectually contentious strips of real estate in the Great Plains. Because if you look closely, really closely, you'll find scattered fragments of stone tools here that don't quite belong together. Points from different Paleo-Indian traditions. Projectile tips with design features from separate cultures. Blade fragments that speak different technological dialects, not in different layers, not from different sites miles apart, but side by side, sometimes in the same surface scatter. Medicine Creek, it turns out, is a crossroads, one that science still hasn't deciphered. Let's rewind. The Paleo-Indian period in North America, roughly 13,000 to 8,000 years ago, is a story often told in clean, elegant arcs. Clovis comes first, with its iconic fluted points and big game hunting reputation. Then Folsom, more refined and adapted to bison. After that, a mosaic of regional groups, each with their own stone traditions, spreading out across the continent as the Ice Age ends and ecosystems change. But Medicine Creek laughs at that simplicity. The valley has yielded an oddly rich mixture of Paleo-Indian materials. Clovis points, Folsom points, Dalton-esque bifaces, even traces of the Cody complex. Tools that, according to the textbook timeline, should have evolved in sequence, not sat together in the same landscape like awkward guests at a family reunion. The question is why? One interpretation is that the valley was occupied continuously, with different cultures replacing one another over millennia, each drawn to the same landscape features: water, stone, shelter, game. That would make Medicine Creek a kind of Paleo-Indian timeshare, used by all, owned by none. But there's a weirder possibility. What if some of these groups coexisted? What if the technological overlap isn't sequential but contemporary? In that case, Medicine Creek wasn't just a passage, it was a borderland, where different groups came into contact, knowingly or not, a place where toolkits bled into one another, where traditions crossed paths, where the idea of us and them became complicated. Of course, that theory assumes interaction, trade maybe, observation, conflict, or silent avoidance. The problem is we have the artifacts, but not the behavior. Stone tools don't tell you whether the owners nodded at each other across the river or never knew the others were there at all. And yet, the diversity of points suggests something more than random drift. There's pattern to the mixture, not chaos. Certain zones of the valley show concentrations of Clovis-style tools. Others lean toward Cody complex markers. Still others are technological hybrids, half this, half that. It's not just a buffet of styles, it's a stratified recipe book. Someone was adapting or copying or blending. The truth is borderlands don't need fences to be real. They exist wherever identities meet terrain. And Medicine Creek, with its oddly democratic mix of stone traditions, may have been one of the earliest. But it wasn't isolated. Just a little farther west, another mystery begins. This time in the Red Smoke Valley, where lithic signatures travel like whispers, crossing time zones and cultural boundaries. The tools there don't just hint at interaction. They might be the fingerprints of a movement, one that began far east of Nebraska, but left unmistakable traces in its soil. 6. May serve red smoke links. There are places on the map that don't look connected, Meserve Creek in the eastern part of Nebraska and the Red Smoke site, tucked into the western sandhills, are over 200 miles apart as the crow flies. No highways tie them together, no shared skyline or matching landmarks, but scratch the surface, literally, and a different kind of link emerges. One made not of roads or rivers, but of stone. Stone that was carried, shaped, flaked, and most strangely, shared. For years, archaeologists working at both sites noticed something odd. The tools found at Red Smoke, particularly the projectile points and bifaces, bore a striking resemblance to the Meserve type found farther east. Both sites featured lanceolate-shaped points, narrow and well-flaked, with a stem that hinted at a transitional moment between early Paleo Indian forms and the later Dalton styles found in the Midwest and Southeast. On paper, the two sites shouldn't overlap much. Meserve Creek is firmly rooted in the eastern woodland grassland transition zone. Red Smoke, on the other hand, sits in an arid dune-parked landscape, wind-blasted, dry and distant from the river valleys that usually attract long-term settlement. But the tools say otherwise. In fact, they whisper something deeply inconvenient to linear timelines. Movement. Possibly a lot of it. This is where things get blurry. Some researchers have argued that the Red Smoke site was an isolated development, an independent emergence of similar technologies due to similar needs. Others suggest diffusion, ideas traveling faster than people. But the third camp sees something more active, migration. A physical movement of people perhaps from the east, bringing their tool-making traditions with them, altering them slightly and adapting to a new environment. Supporting this idea is the raw material itself. Some of the stone used at Red Smoke doesn't match local sources. It's exotic. Flint and chert types that trace back to outcrops east of the Missouri. That's not casual. That's curated. Someone carried those cores a long way. Maybe piece by piece, maybe all at once. But they brought them. They didn't just pick up local material, they chose not to. And then there's the stratigraphy. Red Smoke reveals multiple occupations, and it's clear that the Meserve-like point tradition persists across several layers. This wasn't a one-time event. Whoever brought that lithic style stayed a while, long enough to make a pattern, long enough to become part of the archaeological record, whether they meant to or not. But what makes this all so mysterious is the in-between. Between Meserve and Red Smoke is a vast landscape with almost no sites showing that same toolkit. It's like the footprints skip a few steps, present on either end but absent in the middle. Did they avoid certain areas? Were their campsites ephemeral, washed away, or simply never found? Or does this suggest something more deliberate? A long-distance leap made with intention through a corridor we still haven't mapped? The Meserve-Red Smoke link teases at forgotten routes, arteries of movement now overgrown by millennia of sediment and silence. It forces archaeologists to consider the plains not as static zones of occupation, but as networks. Vast, slow-moving rivers of culture, technology, and memory, braided and branching and periodically vanishing. And yet, For all this inferred motion, one puzzle continues to gnaw at the archaeological imagination. Why hasn't Nebraska produced a single fully intact Clovis or Folsom campsite? The points are everywhere, on river banks, in fields, in private collections, but the places where people actually lived, still missing. As if the ground itself is hiding them, or erasing them. 7. Nebraska's missing intact Clovis Folsom sites. You can't walk across an open field in western Nebraska without tripping over deep thyme. Seriously, farmers, hikers, and collectors have been stumbling across Clovis and Folsom points here for generations. Sleek, fluted, deadly beautiful, and unmistakably ancient. They turn up in plowed fields, blowouts, riverbanks, even gravel roads. If you map the stray finds, they're everywhere. Dots scattered across the state like breadcrumbs from a story that refuses to finish its final chapter. But here's the part that keeps archaeologists up at night. We still haven't found a single fully intact Clovis or Folsom campsite in Nebraska. Not one. Not a fire pit, not a circle of post holes, not a cluster of butchered bones with associated tools. Just pieces. Fragments, ghosts of presence with no confirmed place to haunt. Which raises an awkward question: why? After all, Nebraska sits squarely in the middle of the Paleo-Indian world. The big Ice Age megafauna were here. Mammoths, bison, antiquos, camels. The grassland stretched wide, punctuated by rivers and springs. Everything you'd want if you were a highly mobile hunter-gatherer 13,000 years ago. And yet, the kind of intact kill sites and living floors that have been excavated in places like Colorado, Folsom, New Mexico, Blackwater Draw, or even nearby Kansas, Colorado, simply don't exist here. The state has no shortage of raw materials either. Flint from the Republican river gravels, chert from Dakota Formation outcrops, silicified wood, agate, all plentiful and well distributed. The tools are being made, they're just not being left anywhere convenient for us to study. So what's going on? There are a few working theories, and each one opens a door to a different kind of mystery. The first theory is survey bias. Maybe we haven't looked hard enough in the right places. Much of Nebraska is private land. Sites can be hidden under agriculture or simply missed by broad, surface-level surveys. Paleo-Indian camps are often small and ephemeral. They don't exactly announce themselves. It's entirely possible the intact sites are out there, buried beneath layers of silt or plowed under centuries ago, their stories quietly erased in pursuit of corn. The second theory is taphonomic loss. Nebraska's environment doesn't always play nice with preservation. The state's dynamic rivers have a habit of meandering, flooding, and slicing away evidence like a careless editor. Loess soils and wind-blown sand can both preserve and obliterate a site depending on the context. Maybe the camps were there, and nature just didn't care to keep them. The third theory is more provocative. Maybe the Paleo-Indians didn't really camp here. Not for long, anyway. Perhaps Nebraska was a kill zone, a corridor of movement, not a place to settle in. Maybe the Folsom and Clovis bands came here to hunt, left their points in bison and mammoth bone, and moved on before setting up proper camp elsewhere. This would explain the abundance of projectile points and the absence of domestic debris. In that case, the landscape isn't hiding their camps. It wasn't meant to keep them. And of course, there's always the chance that what we think of as a typical Clovis or Folsom site is skewed by the handful of exceptional sites that did preserve well elsewhere. Maybe Nebraska's Paleo-Indian history is perfectly normal and our expectations are the problem. Still, the absence remains unnerving, like reading a book with all the verbs missing. We have the action points, the impacts, the elegant flutes of stone designed for precision and finality. But where did the people sleep? Where did they talk? Where did they sharpen those tools and plan the next move? No one knows. And yet, for all that's missing, one particular find does break through the silence. A burial, an ancient one, and not just a body, but a ritual, a splash of red ochre that suggests meaning, memory, and maybe even mourning. Because sometimes what survives isn't a campsite, but a grave. 8. Earliest red ochre burial. Who were they? It's easy to forget that bones were once people, until you find one face down in the earth painted with red. Then the past gets uncomfortably personal. In Nebraska's deep archaeological record, dominated by points, flakes, and the cold silence of stone, the discovery of a red ochre burial stands out like a flare in a snowstorm. It's not the oldest human presence in the state, but it's among the oldest intentional ones, and that distinction matters. The burial in question dates back roughly 8,000 years. The Holocene, a time when the Ice Age had fully released its grip, but the land still felt like something raw and unsettled. This individual, gender unclear, age-likely young adult, was buried deliberately with care. And most strikingly, their remains were coated in red ochre, a natural iron pigment used in burials across the ancient world. But in Nebraska, this was unexpected. Red ochre burials are often linked to the broader Archaic and late Paleo-Indian periods across North America. They are found as far east as the Great Lakes and as far south as Texas. Symbolism is never fully explained. Was it ritual, protection, purification? A sign of social status or something more cosmic? In every case, though, the ochre means someone was trying to say something with color. That death wasn't just disposal, it was a statement. But here's the mystery. Who were these people in Nebraska, and what did they believe? Unlike sites where burial goods and grave orientation provide a Rosetta Stone for cultural clues, this ochre burial came with very little context. No elaborate grave goods, no nearby structures, just the pigment, the body, and the silence. It's not even clear which cultural tradition this person belonged to. Some archaeologists tentatively associate the burial with a transitional phase between Paleo-Indian and Archaic groups. Others wonder if it reflects influence from distant Eastern traditions, possibly the red ochre horizon, which stretched across much of the Midwest during this general time frame. But even that's a reach. There's no consensus, no clear tie, just a lonely grave and a pigment that refuses to explain itself. And while the ochre speaks loudly, the body does not. The skeletal remains were fragmentary. No cause of death, no obvious trauma. Just bones returning to dust as bones do. Some argued that the ochre might not even be symbolic, that it could have been part of a preservative or a practical matter. But then again, practicality doesn't usually paint corpses. So we're left with a scene. A body buried in red long ago in a place we didn't expect. A moment of emotion carved into a culture we don't fully understand. It's not the technology that haunts here, it's the intention. Someone cared enough to bury this person with pigment to add that extra layer of meaning. And now, thousands of years later, we're still trying to understand what they meant. What makes this more haunting is the absence of repetition. This isn't part of a cemetery or a known ritual complex. It's an outlier, an isolated signal. Was it a rare custom, a regional deviation, a borrowed practice from a wider world? Whatever it was, it stood apart. Much like the stone circles that dot the sandhills today, quiet formations that also seem to carry cultural weight, but whose messages are equally elusive. Because sometimes the only thing harder than understanding the dead is deciphering the footprints of the living. 9. Teepee rings are short-lived camps in the sandhills. You don't stumble into the sandhills, you end up there. A sea of grass-covered dunes stretching across more than 19,000 square miles. The Nebraska sandhills are a landscape built to mislead. At a distance, they look like soft hills, gently rolling like an old quilt. Up close, they're an endless maze, a living contradiction of motion and stillness, dust and water, isolation and habitation. And scattered across this undulating wilderness are some of the most cryptic footprints in the archaeological record. Stone circles, dozens of them, sometimes more, just lying there in the grass arranged in rings about the size of a small dwelling. Locals call them teepee rings. Archaeologists do too, though not without caution. Because while the rings suggest shelter, portable homes once weighed down by stones, their actual age and cultural identity remain frustratingly vague. Some are barely visible, a suggestion of a circle half swallowed by dune migration. Others are sharp and clear, preserved like scars on the prairie. What they all have in common is absence. No pottery, no hearths, no bones, no storytelling artifacts, just rocks and questions. At face value, the rings point to a nomadic lifestyle, short-lived camps occupied by indigenous groups moving seasonally through the sandhills. The rings are assumed to have held down the edges of hide-covered teepees, protecting them from the prairie winds. The rest, the fires, the voices, the children, the rituals, blew away. But the key mystery isn't what the rings were, it's who made them and when. Radiocarbon dates are scarce and the stone itself is undateable. Without associated organic material, most of the rings float in archaeological limbo. Some could be a few hundred years old. Others could be 1,000. A few might stretch even further into prehistory, though that's speculation built on sediment and hope. Different tribal nations occupied or passed through this region over the centuries. Pawnee, Ponca, Lakota, Cheyenne, and others. But the sandhills are notoriously sparse in durable artifacts that can tie any given ring to a specific group. Oral traditions give hints, but even these are layered, fragmented, and often shaped by post-contact pressures. It's also possible that not all the rings are from the same tradition. Some might be from short-term hunting camps. Others could reflect ceremonial stops or travel routes. Still others might be the remains of communities whose cultural identities don't fit neatly into the historical record. Without more data, we're left with educated guesses. And yet, the rings persist. They aren't flashy or monumental. They don't demand attention. But there's something unnerving about their quiet repetition. A geometry of memory etched in stone, repeated across miles of sand. Why here, of all places? The sandhills aren't easy country. Water is scarce, the soil is loose, and the dunes shift over time. But maybe that's the point. Maybe these camps were meant to be temporary, fleeting, here and gone like a whisper. And maybe the rings weren't meant to last, but did anyway. Their survival feels accidental, but their placement, intentional, deliberate. Someone chose these exact spots again and again and circled their lives with stone. But unlike the tipi rings, our next mystery wasn't built in circles, it was built in layers. Layers of earth, pottery, and culture, perched at the bend of a river that always demanded decisions. Because where the land curves, identity does too. 10. Leary site identities at the Missouri River bend. Where the Missouri River takes a sharp turn near what is now Rulo, Nebraska, the land falls in on itself like a question. A bend in the river, a break in the terrain, and, long ago, perhaps a blur in identity. On a high terrace overlooking this bend sits the Leary site, one of the most significant and persistently puzzling archaeological sites in eastern Nebraska. A village, a mound, a midden, a mosaic. Call it what you want, but don't expect it to fit neatly into any cultural box. The site was first formally excavated in the 1920s by the Smithsonian Institution, but even then it was clear this wasn't going to be simple. The ceramics, for one, were confusing. Some potsherds showed typical Plains village patterns, corded wear, smooth shoulders, basic utilitarian forms. Others looked different, more elaborate. Ota style, with shell tempering, incised lines and flared rims that mirrored pottery traditions hundreds of miles away in what is now Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. That's not a minor detail. That's a red flag, flapping right across the neat lines archaeologists like to draw between cultural groups. So whose village was this? For decades, researchers have argued over the answer. The presence of Oneota pottery has led some to suggest a direct connection to Oneota peoples, perhaps seasonal migration, perhaps a western outpost, or even full-scale migration into the Missouri Valley. Others argue that the Plains village materials dominate, and the Oneota traits represent trade, imitation, or a single household adopting distant styles. Even the site's structure muddies the waters. The Leary site includes house pits, refuse mounds, and a burial mound, elements shared by both Plains village cultures and Oneota settlements. It's not an either-or situation. It's both and or neither nor. Then there's the question of continuity. Radiocarbon dates and artifact stratigraphy suggest multiple occupation phases. Some parts of the site may have been used over generations by different groups, each adding a layer of habitation to the bend in the river. So the real question might not be who lived here, but how many versions of who passed through. And this isn't just an academic exercise. The Leary site sits at the confluence of historical and modern identities. Tribes like the Otoe, Missouri, Iowa, and Omaha have traditional ties to this region. The site's artifacts resonate with their oral histories but don't always line up with modern tribal boundaries drawn by colonization and forced removals. The question of cultural attribution here isn't just about pots. It's about memory, legacy, and whose past gets officially recorded. Today, part of the site is protected, but much of it has been impacted by farming, erosion, and early 20th century excavations that prioritize artifact collection over context. The original Smithsonian dig pulled out thousands of artifacts, then backfilled the trenches and walked away. The bones were boxed up, the pottery catalogued, the mystery left open. What remains is a site that asks a simple question with no simple answer. Where does identity begin and end in the archaeological record? When two cultural traditions meet in a single house pit, whose name do we write on the report? Leary's confusion isn't an outlier, it's a pattern, one that continues up and down the Missouri River, and especially at the next stop in our descent. A massive mound and village complex that suggests wide networks, ceremonial ties, and perhaps the most underexplored question of all. How far did Nebraska's ancient connections really reach? 11. Middle Woodland Shoals Site Networks. Somewhere between the neatly labeled worlds of prehistory and the chaos of deep time, there's a site that keeps quietly disrupting the script. It's called the Shoals Site, and it lies along the Missouri River in northeastern Nebraska. Seemingly ordinary ground with a profoundly complicated past. To walk this area today is to pass through cornfields, drainage ditches, and the vague scent of damp soil. But beneath the topsoil lies a sprawling middle woodland village and mound complex that should, by all conventional wisdom, not be here, not at this scale, and not in this style. When archaeologists began formal work at the Shoals site in the 1960s and 70s, what they found challenged assumptions about eastern Nebraska's role in ancient North American exchange systems. Instead of a modest village at the edge of the known world, the site showed signs of extensive interaction, sophisticated material culture, and a reach that extended far beyond the Missouri Valley. Pottery at Shoals exhibits classic Middle Woodland traits. Hopewell-style influences with thin walls, carefully formed rims, and distinctive decoration. Some shirts are incised or stamped, and a few bear designs almost identical to those found in Illinois or Ohio. Then there are the burial mounds, low earthen rises, some damaged by agriculture but still legible in their intention. Within them, archaeologists found not just bones, but artifacts of far-flung origin, copper, mica, obsidian. That material doesn't occur naturally in Nebraska. It had to be brought here, traded, carried, gifted, or stolen. However it arrived, it means one thing. This community was connected, not isolated, not peripheral, but plugged into the same interregional networks that spanned the eastern half of the continent. And that's where the mystery sharpens. Because the hopeful interaction sphere, the web of trade and ceremonial exchange that flourished around 200 BC to 500 AD, has long been seen as centered in places like southern Ohio, the shining mounds at Newark and Chillicothe, the elaborate burials, the copper repousse plates, the effigy pipes. That's where the headlines go. Nebraska in this framework is out on the fringe, a place for diffusion, not origin. But Schultz doesn't act like a fringe site. Its scale is substantial, its materials are refined, and its placement, perched strategically along a navigable stretch of the Missouri, suggests it may have played a more central role in plains-to-woodland interactions than previously admitted. So, what was this place really? A permanent village, a seasonal ceremonial center, a trade hub? The answers shift depending on which layer of the site you dig into. The mounds, such as long-term occupation and social hierarchy. The artifacts, such as ceremony, ritual, and external contact. But there's also plenty of local material, stone tools, refuse pits, and domestic features that suggest ordinary life humming beneath the glimmer of exotic trade goods. Even the people buried here complicate the narrative. The grave goods vary widely. Some burials are rich, others Spartan. Was this social stratification, cultural mixing, a layered community where outsiders were incorporated or tolerated? The real mystery might be not just how far these people reached, but how far others came to reach them. And just up the river, another chapter unfolds, still within the shadow of Ash Hollow. But this time, the cave is just the beginning. Because while the shelter itself holds ancient stories, the valley around it may be telling one even older. One written not just in stone, but in water. 12. Ash Hollow, locality beyond the cave. Everyone knows about the cave. Ash Hollow Cave is the star attraction, sheltering 6,000 years of human presence beneath a sandstone ledge like a time capsule no one meant to bury. But while excavators have spent decades puzzling over its layers, one quiet truth has begun to emerge. The real mystery may not be inside the cave at all. It may be outside, in the winding valleys, rolling hills, and hidden springs that surround it. Because the broader Ash Hollow locality is more than a backdrop to a well-known site. It's a massive, loosely defined archaeological landscape that resists containment and refuses singular interpretation. Scattered throughout this wider area, especially along the ridges and terraces above Blue Creek, are surface finds and site clusters that suggest repeated widespread human use over millennia. Campsites, lithic scatters, bison processing areas, ephemeral shelters, all emerging in patchwork patterns across the landscape. Some are clearly tied to the known periods of cave use. Others hint at entirely different timelines, a broader choreography of arrival, departure, return. But here's the unresolved question. What drove this persistence? The cave, after all, isn't especially large. It could never have housed a full-scale village. Yet the region around it seems to have magnetized people again and again. Was it the access to freshwater springs, the abundance of raw lithic material, the natural topography, offering both visibility and protection? Or was it something less tangible, an echo of memory, a whispered reputation passed down through oral traditions? Climatological reconstructions add another layer. During the mid-Holocene, this region underwent multiple significant climate swings, from weather episodes supporting lush grasslands to arid intervals that desiccated shallow creeks and pushed people to adapt, migrate, or consolidate. And through all of that, the Ash Hollow area seems to have remained in use. That resilience, the ability of the locality to draw and sustain people across climatic shifts, is what researchers are now trying to understand. Paleoecological quarries from nearby wetlands show pulses of marsh growth and die back, reflecting fluctuating water tables. Some periods may have supported rich wetland ecosystems teeming with waterfowl and game. Others may have turned the valleys into dry corridors of survival. Yet through it all, the archaeology suggests people stayed nearby, improvising their lifeways to the beat of the land's mood swings. And then there's the geology. Ash Hollow sits at the intersection of multiple sedimentary layers, exposed in outcrops that offered stone for tools, possibly attracted game animals to mineral-rich soils. This fusion of geologic and hydrologic advantages made the broader area not just habitable, but strategically valuable. Not in the sense of fortresses or control, but as a consistent pause point in the long migratory flow across the Great Plains. Still, despite decades of fieldwork, the archaeological record here remains maddeningly incomplete. Many sites are only lightly tested or known from surface finds. Layers blur, dates don't always cooperate, and the question of whether Ash Hollow functioned as a central place in a cultural memory or merely a good camping spot remains open. But one thing is clear. Ash Hollow didn't just shelter people, it held them. Long enough to leave traces, long enough to matter, long enough that the land itself may have started shaping the story more than the people did, which brings us to a very different kind of hollow. One filled not with campers or ceremonies, but with bones, thousands of them. Because not far from here lies a bison bone bed, so densely packed, so eerily specific, that it sparked one of the longest-running arguments in plains archaeology. A question not of who lived, but of how they died. 13. Hudson-Meng bison bone bed. Mass hunt or mass die-off. In the high tablelands of the Oglala National Grassland, near Nebraska's northwestern corner, the prairie seems endless. But just beneath the surface, a secret waits, silent, dense, and deeply contested. At first glance, the Hudson-Meng bone bed looks like a pile of bones. A lot of bones, thousands of them packed into a shallow basin and jumbled in ways that seem chaotic at first. Until you realize they're almost all from one animal. Bison. Not modern bison, not even the kind you'd see in a 19th century painting. These are Bison antiquus, a larger Pleistocene-era cousin of the modern buffalo. When the site was first uncovered in the 1950s during a windmill construction project, it was thought to be a massive Paleo-Indian kill site. A place where ancient hunters coordinated an extraordinary drive or ambush, slaughtering a herd all at once in a moment of sheer strategic brilliance. The narrative practically wrote itself. The Clovis people, or perhaps Folsom or Cody complex hunters, organizing a communal hunt, stampeding bison into a trap and leaving behind the residue of a feast or a ritual. But then things got messy. Literally. Excavations revealed little evidence of human activity. No stone tools, no cut marks, no clear butchering signs, no fire-cracked rock. Just bone. Layer upon layer of it. At least 600 individual bison tightly stacked, many in articulated positions, suggesting they died quickly and remained largely undisturbed. That's not typical for a kill site, where the bones are usually scattered, processed, and often missing parts that were carried off for food or tools. So, the theory changed. Maybe this wasn't a hunt. Maybe it was a natural die-off, caused by drought, disease, or a sudden environmental catastrophe. A mass death, not a massacre. The bones settled where the animals fell, preserved by the alkaline soils and stable climate. But that answer didn't sit right either. Subtle signs of disturbance in certain layers, a few lithic flakes, a possible hearth feature nearby. Were these hints of human activity or just coincidences? Later occupations unrelated to the bonebed itself. Even the dating created tension. Radiocarbon samples range from about 9,500 to 10,000 years ago, placing it within the time frame of early hunter-gatherers. But the gaps between the layers suggested that the deaths may have occurred in multiple events, not one big tragedy. Some archaeologists now propose a hybrid theory. Perhaps these were opportunistic scavenging episodes. A group stumbles upon dead or dying bison and strips usable parts. Not a planned hunt, but not entirely natural either. A gray area of use and memory. And so Hudson Meng remains in limbo. A site caught between interpretations, shaped by evidence that refuses to lean definitively in any direction. It asks an unsettling question. Can you really tell the difference between a massacre and a coincidence after 10,000 years? What makes the site so compelling isn't just the scale, it's the ambiguity. It's the way certainty slips through the fingers the more you dig. The bones speak, but not clearly. The land remembers, but not kindly. And yet, just west of Hudson Meng lies another bone bed. Bigger, older, stranger. Not human this time. Not even close. Because there, locked in a stone, is a fossilized graveyard of Miocene mammals, perfectly preserved in the volcanic remains of an ancient catastrophe. But how exactly they died, and why so many died together, still has scientists arguing across disciplines. From archaeology to paleontology, we follow the trail of unexplained death, And it only gets deeper. 14. Agate fossil beds, bonebeds, drought cycles, or something else. Out where Nebraska begins to forget it's Nebraska, where the hills rise into dry waves and the prairie breaks into badlands, there's a place that looks like time gave up trying to move forward. Fossils lie just beneath the surface like wreckage frozen mid-disaster, not chipped into fragments, not scattered across eons, but clustered, packed together like animals pushed into a bottleneck and told they weren't going anywhere. Welcome to the Agate fossil beds, one of the richest and most perplexing fossil sites in North America. Discovered in the late 19th century and excavated heavily in the early 20th, the site quickly made headlines, not just for the number of fossils, but for their perfect preservation and sheer density. Entire skeletons of extinct mammals were unearthed. Menoceras, a big-sized rhinoceros, Stenomylus, a gazelle-like camel, Moropus, an ungainly creature with claws instead of hooves, and Daphoenodon, a bone-crunching dog. All clustered in what paleontologists now call bonebeds, layers of ancient death crammed into a few square kilometers. The main question that's haunted the site since its discovery is brutally simple. Why did so many animals die here, and not just once, but repeatedly, across multiple pulses of fossil deposition during the early Miocene, roughly 19 to 20 million years ago? The traditional explanation has been drought. A climate shift dries up the grasslands. Animals crowd around the last remaining waterholes. Food vanishes. Weaker individuals die first, and their bodies attract predators and scavengers, who eventually die themselves as the collapse spirals. When the rains return, sediments bury the remains in a sudden influx of silt and clay, perfect for fossilization. It's a neat theory. It explains the preservation, the density, even the mixture of species. But it's not the only theory, and it's not airtight. For one thing, some of the bonebeds show signs of rapid burial, almost catastrophic, with little evidence of long-term weathering or scavenging. That doesn't match the slow attrition of a classic drought scenario. Instead, it hints at a sudden event, a collapse or a flood or dust-choked suffocation. There's also the strange patterning of the animals themselves. In some layers, specific species dominate, dozens of Menoceras, packed side by side like dominoes tipped over mid-step. In others, predators are disproportionately absent or clustered too closely for coincidence. It's as if the deaths weren't random but selective, something targeted, something periodic. Newer paleoecological research has proposed a more nuanced model, a combination of cyclic drought, toxic water conditions, and volcanic ashfall from distant eruptions, including those responsible for the ashfall fossil beds. In this version, the Agate region becomes a deadly trap, not all the time, but just often enough. Animals drawn to the water during periods of scarcity might have encountered tainted resources, environmental stress, or sudden ash exposure. They stayed too long. They didn't leave. But the fossil record doesn't hand out clear cause of death labels. No bullet holes, no trauma patterns, just silence and posture and dust. To this day, paleontologists still debate which factor mattered most: drought, disease, ash, or something else entirely, maybe even behavior. Herd instincts pushing species into shared danger zones again and again. A fatal repetition written into the bones. And while the agate fossil beds still echo with mystery, one set of fossils nearby takes the question of behavior and environment a step further, into the bizarre. Not bones this time, not tools or shelters, spirals, perfect spirals, dug into ancient soil like some prehistoric blueprint for madness. And for decades, no one could figure out who made them or why. 15. The Devil's Corkscrews, Demonelix. Imagine walking across a sun-baked Badlands ridge in western Nebraska. The wind cuts low and dry. The hills look as if they've been drained of color. And then, poking up from the ground like fossilized plumbing from a vanished civilization, you see one, a spiral. Not just a curve in stone, but a full helix coiling upward out of the ancient soil like it was bored by a giant drill or something worse. This is the land of the Demonelix, more famously, if somewhat dramatically, known as the Devil's Corkscrews. For over a century, these spiral structures have sparked confusion, debate, and no small amount of folklore. Early ranchers found them protruding from the hillsides and named them accordingly: demonic tools, unnatural growths, petrified roots, fossilized whirlpools. They look engineered, perfectly coiled, often several feet tall, sometimes branching off in strange patterns. Whatever made them, it clearly wasn't in a hurry. And for decades, science didn't have a better answer. When paleontologists first encountered these features in the late 19th century, some believed they were fossilized remains of freshwater sponges or algae. Others proposed they were giant burrowing plants. One even suggested they might be gas escape structures from methane-rich muds. That's how odd they were. They didn't fit into any known category. But then came the real twist. Eventually, fossilized bones and teeth were found embedded near or within the corkscrews, specifically those of a Miocene rodent known as Paleocastor, an extinct genus of prehistoric beaver. That discovery flipped the script. The spirals weren't plants or geologic curiosities. They were burrows, helical tunnels dug by ancient beavers, not into water, but into sediment. The Devil's Corkscrews were homes. But even that explanation opens up more mystery than it closes. For one, the corkscrew shape itself is deeply unusual. Modern burrowing mammals tend to dig vertically or horizontally, with turns and chambers, but few precise geometries. So why the perfect helix? Was it adaptive, a method for moisture control, a defensive spiral to deter predators, or manage temperature extremes? Some researchers suggest the spiral shape offered stability in loose sediments. Others propose it allowed the animals to regulate temperature and humidity in an otherwise hostile environment, essentially building their own microclimate underground. But to this day, no one has definitively proven why Paleocastor evolved this unique burrowing behavior, where no modern beaver, prairie dog, or ground squirrel comes close. And even stranger, some corkscrews include side chambers. In one famous specimen, the bones of both a beaver and its likely predator, Zodiolestis, a small carnivorous mammal, were found in the same spiral. The predator had followed its prey into the depths, and neither made it out. The spiral had become a tomb. So now we're left with a landscape littered with fossilized architecture, evidence of animals that engineered their own environments in ways we barely understand. Not just digging for shelter, but designing space, creating a biological structure that endured tens of millions of years. It's almost ironic. The structures that once looked unnatural turned out to be natural. But the more we learned, the less they felt ordinary. And if the devil's corkscrews confuse with their perfection, the next mystery offers the opposite. Chaos, captured mid-stride. Not a fossilized home, but a fossilized moment of movement, migration, and maybe panic, written in tracks that couldn't have been faked, but still refused to be fully understood. 16. Toadstools trackways. In the stark, sun-bleached badlands of northwestern Nebraska, there's a place where the rocks look like they've melted, then hardened into surreal forms. Balanced columns, mushroom-like spires, wind-eroded ledges. It's called Toadstool Geologic Park, and it feels more like the moon than the Midwest. But underfoot, hidden in the same sediments that sculpted this alien terrain, lies something even stranger than the rocks. Footprints. Lots of them. Frozen mid-motion in the ancient Oligocene mud are fossilized trackways, preserved trails left by animals long extinct. Herds, predators, lone wanderers, their footfalls press into the soft ground some 30 million years ago, then buried and hardened into stone as if time hit the pause button and forgot to unpause. At first glance, they seem simple. Traces, fossilized movement, a parade of prehistoric life captured in silhouette. But like everything else in this landscape, they refuse to stay simple for long. The tracks at Toadstool include prints from a wide range of Oligocene mammals. Three-toed ungulates, camel-like forms, early rhino relatives, small, dog-like carnivores. And the more researchers study the tracks, the more complicated the picture becomes. Because these aren't just isolated steps, they're paths. Some cross, some cluster, some repeat in ways that hints at something deeper behavior. Take, for instance, the parallel sets of tracks that suggest group movement, perhaps herds or family units, or the zigzagging patterns that indicate hesitation or evasion. Some sets curve sharply, as if the animal was turning at speed. Others terminate abruptly, like something startled the creature mid-step. And then there's the layering. Multiple sets of tracks are preserved in stacked strata, suggesting not a single moment, but multiple episodes of movement through the same mudflat. A congregation point, a migration route, a kill site. The sediment doesn't always cooperate. It tells us what happened, feet pressing down, but rarely why. Paleoichnologists, the scientists who study trace fossils, have tried to piece together the story. They mapped the prints, compared gait patterns, analyzed stride lengths and toe spread. Was the animal walking or running? Was it alone? How deep was the mud? Was it wet season or dry? Even after all this, many questions remain unresolved. For example, some of the larger tracks appear to have been reused by smaller animals later on, creating overprinted fossils that confuse species identification. Others show deformation from slumping sediment, suggesting environmental shifts that may have altered the track's original meaning. The record, like the land itself, shifts, and yet it's hard not to feel something intimate when looking at these prints. They aren't bones, they aren't tools, they're not the leftovers of death, but the literal impressions of life. A moment of pressure, a passing step, an animal walking across a floodplain 30 million years ago, unaware it was writing history in mud. Toadstools' trackways force us to think differently about fossils, not just as artifacts, but as events. A behavior captured, not just a body. But as strange as it is to find fossilized motion, stranger still is what came next. A silent rain of volcanic ash, hundreds of miles from its source, falling over eastern Nebraska like judgment, preserves skeletons in uncanny detail, but only by stopping them mid-breath. Because what came down next wasn't just dust, it was death in slow motion, and its source, still a topic of debate. 17. Ashfall's ash source. The skies didn't go dark in Nebraska. Not exactly. There was no eruption visible on the horizon, no mountains belching fire, no fleeing herds silhouetted against a wall of flame. What came was quieter, more insidious, a haze, a shift in the light, a fall of ash so fine it would have felt like walking through flour, and, in the end, a graveyard. The Ashfall fossil beds, located in northeastern Nebraska, contain one of the most astonishing fossil assemblages on the planet. Entire skeletons, rhinos, camels, horses, turtles, birds, perfectly preserved, many in lifelike positions, as if they had just laid down for a rest and never got back up. No scattering, no scavenging. Bones in full articulation. Ribs still curved, skulls intact. It's a paleontological diorama frozen in time. But where did the ash come from? The dominant theory points west, to Idaho, specifically to the Bruno Jar Beach caldera complex, part of the ancient Yellowstone hotspot system. Around 12 million years ago, a massive eruption from that caldera sent a high-altitude plume of volcanic ash drifting eastward. Carried by upper-level winds, the ash traveled more than 1,000 miles before it settled across the Central Plains. Nebraska was directly in the path. The result, a sheet of silicate-rich volcanic dust, meters thick in places blanketing the landscape. In areas like Ashfall, where water pooled and animals gathered, the consequences were catastrophic. The ash-clogged lungs coated vegetation and turned watering holes into deadly traps. But here's the twist. Even though the Bruno Jar Beach eruption is the leading candidate, it's not the only one. The problem lies in the complexity of tephrochronology, the science of tracing volcanic ash layers across space and time. Volcanic eruptions often produce similar chemical signatures, especially if they originate from the same hotspot system. When analyzing ancient ash deposits, geochemists look at glass shard composition, trace elements, and isotopic ratios to fingerprint a specific source, but those prints can get smudged. Some have proposed alternative sources for the ashfall deposit. Could another caldera in the Yellowstone system have erupted around the same time? Could regional wind patterns have delivered ash from a more southerly or northerly plume? Could multiple eruptions have contributed to the layer now known as the ashfall tuff? Even if Bruno garbage is the most likely culprit, scientists still debate the mechanics of how the ash got here. How high did the plume rise? How fast did it travel? Did it fall as one steady rain of dust or in intermittent pulses over weeks or months? These questions matter because they shape our understanding of what happened to the animals. A fast, heavy fall might have killed quickly. A slow accumulation could mean prolonged exposure, suffering, and migration attempts, cut short by the very watering holes that once offered life. And then there's the atmospheric angle. Some climatologists suggest that such eruptions may have caused regional cooling or altered precipitation patterns. Ash in the upper atmosphere can block sunlight, shift jet streams, and cascade into ecological collapse. So was ashfall an isolated tragedy, or just one visible piece of a much larger chain reaction? We may never know for sure. The source volcano, now eroded and unrecognizable, hides behind layers of younger rock. Its smoke is long gone, but its shadow remains, in Nebraska of all places. And the ash it left behind didn't just bury bones, it changed them. Because in that fine volcanic dust, something happened to the bodies that turned ordinary fossils into pathological exhibits. Rhinos with swollen limbs, horses with bone growths, creatures slowly turning to stone while still in pain. 18. Ashfall's fatal pathology. The animals at Ashfall didn't just die, they deteriorated. When paleontologists first began excavating the fossil bed in the 1970s, they expected to find typical post-mortem remains, bones stripped clean by scavengers or scattered by wind and erosion. Instead, they uncovered something far more disturbing. Whole skeletons still in place, lying as they fell. Rhinos curled up on their sides, horses collapsed mid-step, turtles caught halfway between water and land. All of them entombed in volcanic ash, so fine it still clings to tools during excavation today. But it wasn't just the preservation that caught scientists off guard. It was what the bones themselves revealed. Many of the animals at Ashfall show signs of a specific and deeply unusual condition, hypertrophic osteopathy, a disease that causes abnormal bone growth, particularly in the limbs and ribs. Under the microscope, the evidence is unmistakable. Long bones show porous, lacy textures where new bone tissue forms rapidly and unevenly. In life, this would have caused pain, swelling, and difficulty walking. What could have caused it? In modern veterinary medicine, hypertrophic osteopathy is usually secondary, a reaction, not a root problem. It often arises in animals suffering from chronic lung conditions, like infections or tumors. Essentially, the lungs begin to fail, and the body, in a strange biological misfire, starts growing excess bone in response. In the case of ashfall, the culprit seems clear: volcanic ash inhalation. The ash wasn't just a blanket over the land, it was in the air, breathed in by every living creature that passed through the area. Fine-grained and silica-rich, it would have acted like microscopic glass shards, cutting into respiratory tissue, triggering inflammation, fluid buildup, and eventually respiratory failure. As the lungs struggled, the body responded, wrongly, by thickening the limbs. This pathology wasn't visible when the animals first died. It was locked inside their bones, invisible until scientists began slicing, scanning, and studying in detail. What emerged was a portrait not just of death, but of slow decline. Some animals survived days, maybe even weeks, after the ash began to fall. They didn't die instantly. They got sick, then sicker. They struggled to walk. Some fell and never got back up. Even more telling is that different species responded differently. The rhinos, for example, show the most extensive signs of hypertrophic osteopathy, suggesting they lingered the longest. Horses show some signs. Smaller animals, deer, camels, birds, less so. That variance tells us something chilling. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was prolonged, a drawn-out biological unraveling. But even now, researchers debate the timeline. How long did the ash fall? Was it continuous, or did it come in waves? How much ash does it take to trigger respiratory collapse in a rhinoceros-sized mammal? We don't have modern analogs to test these scenarios, thankfully. What makes the ashfall pathology so important and unsettling is that it gives us one of the rarest things in paleontology, a glimpse into how it felt to die in deep time. Not just when or where, but what it did to the body. This isn't just data. It's a form of empathy through science, reading trauma through tissue, decoding suffering from sediment. And though the victims have long since turned to stone, their diseases endure, frozen in bone like a diagnosis delivered too late. But beneath all that pain, a question remains unanswered. Why were these animals here at all? What drew so many large mammals to this exact spot again and again, even as danger thickened in the air? To answer that, we have to look not at their deaths, but at the lives they were trying to live. Social lives, seasonal habits, and maybe a watering hole that betrayed them. 19. How did the ashfall rhinos live? Before they became statues in a grave of dust, the rhinos of ashfall were alive, and not just existing but thriving. They didn't stand out as symbols of doom. They were just another part of Nebraska's Miocene menagerie, wandering through grasslands that have long since turned to rock. They were Teleoceras, a barrel-chested hippo-sized rhinoceros that once roamed much of North America. Unlike their African cousins, these rhinos weren't solitary brutes or horned tanks of territorial rage. The fossil evidence at Ashfall suggests something far more delicate and oddly modern: social structure. The remains of over a dozen teleoceras have been excavated from the Ashfall fossil beds so far. Most are clustered together, in death, yes, but likely in life too. Their bodies lie in overlapping orientations, many of them facing the same direction. This is not the layout of random dispersal. It's not the mess of scattered death from a chaotic stampede. It's calm, orderly, almost familial. Add to that the fact that the individuals include a range of ages: juveniles, sub-adults, mature adults. This isn't just a coincidence. It suggests a multi-generational herd, much like modern elephants or bison. Group living mammals, social bonds, structured movement across the landscape. That interpretation gains strength from the latest isotopic studies conducted on the rhino teeth. Researchers have analyzed oxygen and carbon isotopes locked in the enamel, which reflect not only what the animals were eating, but when and where they were eating it. The data points to seasonal variation in diet and water intake, evidence that these rhinos weren't just lingering around one place all year, but migrating across a predictable circuit. In other words, the Ashfall waterhole wasn't just a random gathering point. It was likely part of their annual routine, a seasonal stop, maybe at the height of dry season, when water sources dwindled elsewhere. A place they'd returned to before, a trusted landmark. And that makes the tragedy of Ashfall all the more grim. Because what killed these animals wasn't just bad luck, it was a breakdown in the trust. A known safe zone became a trap, not by design but by planetary accident. Ash filled the air, but the landscape hadn't changed. From a distance, the water still shimmered. The grass still grew, but each breath brought more damage. What's even stranger is that the other animals followed the same pattern. Horses, camels, birds, many of them found near or among the rhinos, as if they too were part of this seasonal convergence. Not necessarily herding together, but sharing a rhythm, drawn in by the same ecological cues. It paints a picture of an ancient plain alive with cycles, migratory pathways crisscrossing open grassland, waterholes becoming points of congregation, and species coexisting not just in space but in time. And here's where it gets deeply ironic. The very patterns that allowed these animals to thrive, cooperation, migration, routine, also made them vulnerable. When the ash began to fall, the animals didn't run. Not at first. They waited. They stayed. Because this was the place you waited things out. But survival depends on reading the signs correctly. And this time, the signs were wrong. Still, another question lurks in the volcanic quiet. Why are their skeletons so pristine? Why didn't scavengers tear them apart? Why didn't the wind scatter their remains? Why, after millions of years, are they still lying there like they never even tried to leave? 20. Why are Ashfall skeletons so pristine? Death usually doesn't arrange itself neatly. In most fossil sites, bones are a mess. Scattered, trampled, partially eaten, moved by wind, water, gravity, or the hungry curiosity of scavengers. Bodies break down fast within hours in some ecosystems. Even in places with rapid burial, the remains are often fragmented or jumbled, compressed by time or disturbed by burrowing animals, roots, or shifting earth. But not at ashfall. At ashfall fossil beds, the skeletons are not just preserved, they're pristine. Ribs still arch in natural curvature. Skull bones are fully articulated. Neck vertebrae remain connected in graceful arcs. Tiny foot bones sit in perfect alignment. There are even birds with their wing joints intact. It's the kind of preservation that would seem staged if it weren't buried beneath meters of volcanic ash. So how did this happen? What combination of environmental factors, biological behavior, and geological luck could allow such exquisite fossilization? The first piece of the puzzle is the ash itself. The fine volcanic material that fell over northeastern Nebraska around 12 million years ago came from a distant super eruption, likely from the Bruno-Jarbidge caldera in what's now Idaho. This ash wasn't gravelly or chunky, it was microscopic, almost talcum powder fine. Once airborne, it would have created a dense choking haze. Once deposited, it settled softly but persistently, forming an airtight blanket over the land. This consistency is key. It meant that when animals collapsed near the water hole, dying slowly from respiratory failure or sudden ash inhalation, their bodies were immediately covered by a layer of settling dust, not instantly buried, but gradually entombed. There was no scavenging, because most scavengers either fled the area or died themselves. There was no trampling because movement ceased. There was no time for the usual decay to set in. The second factor is hydrology. Ashfall wasn't just open prairie, it was a shallow basin with a water hole at its center. The presence of water may have helped slow decomposition, reduce oxidation, and stabilize the soil surface around the dead. As the animals congregated near the water, they died in close proximity. As the basin continued to accumulate ash, rain after rain, breath after breath, the bodies were preserved in place. They weren't buried by sediment washed in from floods or rivers. They were buried by air itself. Third, there's the lack of environmental disturbance post-burial. Over millions of years, this part of Nebraska stayed relatively geologically quiet. No major tectonic activity, no deep glaciation, no catastrophic erosion. The layers above the fossil bed compacted gently, preserving not just bones but delicate bone surfaces, joint connections, and even spatial relationships between individuals. But the final and most overlooked element might be behavior. The animals didn't die all at once. The fossil evidence suggests that many lingered, returning to the watering hole day after day, even as the air thickened and breathing became difficult. They died where they drank or where they lay down to rest. Their positions suggest they were not panicking at the moment of death. There was no struggle to flee. That calmness preserved their posture, their herd instincts, their trust in familiar ground, and their failure to recognize a new kind of danger. All of it led them to lie down gently and not get back up. It's almost surgical in its preservation, beautiful and deeply unsettling. a quiet death that unfolded in slow motion across days or weeks. And then permanence, not through violence but stillness. Ashfall is often compared to Pompeii, but the analogy only goes so far. Pompeii was abrupt, explosive, and dramatic. Ashfall was soft, persistent, inevitable. A betrayal not by flame, but by dust. And while the bodies stayed put, the land around them kept changing. The water hole that trapped them became a fossil vault. The soft volcanic ash hardened into a protective layer. And the valley itself, shaped by millions of years of geologic history, began to reveal another mystery. Because just north of Ashfall lies a river unlike any other in Nebraska. Not because of what it carries, but because of what it cut through. A channel so deep and precise, scientists still argue over what carved it, how fast and why the stone beneath gave way like a secret. 21. Niobrara River's deep cut. The Niobrara River doesn't look like much at first. It's quiet, meandering. A scenic stretch of water that seems more suited to lazy tubing and weekend kayaking than geologic controversy. But if you follow it long enough, watch the banks rise, watch the canyon walls close in, you'll start to notice something strange. The Niobrara doesn't just wander across the landscape, it slices through it. In some places, the river has cut hundreds of feet down into layers of ancient rock. Cretaceous shales, Miocene sands, Ogallala gravels, carving a deep confined channel that shouldn't be there, at least not in its current form. Other rivers in the region don't behave this way. They braid, meander, shift. The Niobrara, by contrast, holds its course with surgical focus, dropping through stone like it was following instructions. So what happened here? Geologists have been asking that question for decades. The most common theory points to base-level changes during the Pleistocene. As continental glaciers advanced and retreated to the north, they altered regional drainage patterns and caused dramatic shifts in river gradients. If the Missouri River, into which the Niobrara flows, dropped its elevation due to glacial carving or meltwater outwash, that would have created a steep new gradient for the Niobrara. The result? Downcutting. Lots of it. Fast. In this model, the Niobrara is simply a river responding to new rules, new slopes, new paths, new erosive power. But that explanation, while elegant, doesn't fully satisfy everyone, because the rate and precision of the incision don't match up evenly across the landscape. Some sections show deeper cuts than others, even in geologically similar areas. Some tributaries didn't keep pace. Others were left behind entirely, stranded above the main channel like forgotten stairs in a half-renovated house. Then there's the question of confinement. In certain segments, the Niobrara is wedged tightly between steep canyon walls, bordered by resistant rock that should have forced the river to find a new path long ago. But it didn't. It kept cutting, as if locked into a route by some unseen constraint. Could it be an ancient fault line, a buried structural weakness that the river exploited? Possibly. Some researchers have speculated about tectonic influences on the river's incision path, though clear evidence remains elusive. Others have proposed that what we're seeing isn't a single river's work at all, but the inherited course of a much older drainage system, long since altered, partially buried, and then reactivated under different climatic conditions. And it's not just the cut, it's what's in it. The Niobrara Valley contains a staggering diversity of ecological zones. 6 different eco-regions converge here, from mixed grass prairie to pine-covered bluffs. That's highly unusual. It suggests the river isn't just carving through rock. It's exposing biological crossroads, a place where east meets west, where plants and animals from different climatic histories now coexist in improbable proximity. In other words, the deep cut is more than a scar. It's a window into climate shifts, drainage rearrangements, and possible tectonic nudges that Nebraska's supposedly stable interior isn't supposed to have. Even today, with LiDAR, satellite imaging, and digital elevation models, geologists still debate the timing and mechanism of the Niobrara's incision. Was it sudden, episodic? Is the modern river even the true author of the canyon it flows through? Whatever the answer, one thing is clear. The Niobrara didn't just carve the land. It carved a path through time, a vertical record of geologic decisions made over millions of years, now unspooled in stone. And beneath those layers it slides through, there's another story. A set of ancient riverbeds that don't flow anymore. Not above ground anyway, because they've been buried. And mapping them means reading a river that hasn't seen sunlight in 50,000 years. 22. Ancient rivers underfoot. Sometimes the most important rivers aren't the ones you can see. Across eastern Nebraska, in the shadows of Loess Hills and under fields that seem perfectly ordinary, something strange runs just beneath the surface, a system of invisible rivers. Not metaphorical ones, not spiritual ones, real rivers. Wide, deep, ancient, buried, forgotten by the landscape that once depended on them. These are the paleochannels, fossilized remnants of Ice Age rivers that flowed tens of thousands of years ago, then disappeared beneath layers of sediment and glacial debris. Today, they don't carry water across the surface, but they still exist as subterranean scars, shaping the movement of groundwater, controlling soil moisture, and quietly warping the archaeological and ecological maps of Nebraska in ways few people realize. But where exactly are they? And how do we even know they're there? The answer starts with geophysics. In the late 20th century, geologists and hydrologists began mapping subsurface features using seismic surveys, drill cores, and electrical resistivity imaging. What they found were enormous buried channels, some as wide as a mile and hundreds of feet deep. These aren't little creeks. They are the ghosts of major rivers, preserved in sand and gravel beneath the modern landscape. Some of these paleochannels follow the course of modern rivers, parallel or braided systems that shifted over time, but others run in completely different directions, disconnected from today's hydrology. In some areas, water once flowed north or west, in reverse of the modern pattern. These ancient routes likely date to pre-glacial and interglacial periods, when drainage basins were shaped by very different climatic forces. During the advance of the Laurentide ice sheet, glacial meltwater would have poured into these channels, carving them deeper and flushing them with silt and debris. When the glaciers retreated, the rivers either dried up, were diverted, or simply filled with wind-blown loess. What was left behind were hollowed basins, filled and forgotten, until farmers' wells and seismic tests rediscovered them. And that's where archaeology comes in. Because these buried riverbeds weren't just geological curiosities. They were corridors, pathways for human movement, lines of resource availability, and possibly sites of early occupation. But here's the catch. They're hidden. Whatever campsites, tools, bones, or fire pits were left behind near these ancient rivers are now buried beneath meters of sediment, often with no surface indicators at all. So how do you excavate a river you can't see? The answer so far is slowly. Remote sensing has identified several high potential areas where buried channels intersect with paleodune fields or terrace systems. In some cases, ancient soils have been preserved in pockets along these paleochannels called paleosols, and within them microdebris from prehistoric activity. A few sites have yielded flakes, pools, even hearth features, suggesting that people may have camped along these vanished waterways during warmer periods between glacial advances. But most of the puzzle remains underground, and time isn't helping. Agricultural development, groundwater pumping, and erosion are actively reshaping the shallow layers above these paleochannels, making future detection even harder. It's a race between curiosity and obliteration. Still, the buried rivers remain. They guide the flow of the Ogallala and other aquifers. They shape the fertility of fields. They distort GPS-based elevation models. And they hint at a different Nebraska. A Nebraska with rivers where none exist now, with people following paths that modern maps no longer remember. But these aren't the only ghost rivers in the state. Some ancient watercourses didn't just vanish, they inverted. Their channels filled, hardened, and now stand as ridges, elevated above the landscape they once carved. Which means the next mystery doesn't lie below your feet. It towers above them. 23. Exhumed fluvial ridges. Imagine walking across the Nebraska plains and finding a ridge, a high, narrow rise, cutting across the terrain like the spine of something long buried. But here's the twist. It's not a hill that resisted erosion. It's a river. Or rather, it used to be. These are known as exhumed fluvial ridges, and they're some of the most quietly baffling features in the state's prehistoric landscape. They don't follow the rules. Rivers are supposed to erode land, not rise above it. They're supposed to cut down, not build up. And yet, here they are, fossilized channels elevated above the surrounding land like veins frozen in mid-pulse. So how does a riverbed become a ridge? The process begins, ironically, with abandonment. At some point, an ancient river, perhaps braided, perhaps meandering, ceased to flow in its original course. Maybe it was diverted by glacial meltwater. Maybe it dried up during a drought. Whatever the reason, the channel stopped carrying water and began carrying something else, sediment. Over time, these abandoned channels filled with coarse materials, gravel, sand, sometimes volcanic ash. That sediment settled and cemented, often harder than the surrounding landscape. Lows continued to blow across the plains, layering the edges. Rainfall carried fine silt across the old floodplain. The ground around the filled-in river channel lowered, eroded by time, while the hardened fill of the channel remained, eventually emerging, not as a ditch, but as a reach. A river turned inside out. Geologists have been mapping these features with growing interest. Some are kilometers long, narrow, and surprisingly linear, cutting across dunes, grasslands, and even buried paleosols. They can be difficult to detect at ground level. Subtle humps in the prairie, often dismissed as terraces or minor uplifts, but satellite imagery, LiDAR, and digital elevation models reveal their unmistakable signature. Snaking forms, sinuous and branching, mimicking modern drainage patterns. In reverse. What's even more intriguing is that these exhumed ridges often preserve a stratified record of climatic history. The sedimentary layers within the fossilized channels sometimes contain pollen, charcoal, and even isolated artifacts. Tiny fragments of human presence left behind by people who camped or hunted along the ancient river banks, unaware that the campground would one day become a hilltop. That's the archaeological hook. These reaches weren't always reaches. They were once valleys, and valleys were places of life. Access to water, game, mobility, which means these upside-down rivers may also be inverted highways of prehistoric activity. A record of human geography preserved not in footprint trails, but in the geometry of the land itself. But the story doesn't end there. Because these fossil rivers aren't just geological oddities, they're tied to climatic shifts. Some exhumed channels appear to correspond with periods of abrupt drying, when river systems collapsed and dune fields began to encroach. Others suggest tectonic influences, subtle changes in land tilt that altered regional drainage without warning. So what triggered the abandonment of these rivers? Was it climate, tectonics, or a slow death by sediment? And why did some channels fossilize into ridges while others vanished entirely? No one agrees, but as baffling as these raised rivers are, they're not the largest hydrological ghosts in the region. The title belongs to a system not just of rivers, but of megafans. Massive, telescoping sheets of alluvium spilled out from the Rocky Mountains, flowing eastward into the plains like geological tsunamis, smooth flat by time, but still hiding something enormous beneath the surface, something that may have buffered or blurred the signals of climate, erosion, and human passage for thousands of years. 24. Telescopic megafans of the ancestral South Platte out on the high plains of western Nebraska, where the landscape seems flatter than logic and the horizon runs on forever. There's a secret buried in plain sight. It doesn't look like much, just endless fields of alluvium, subtly sloping, broken only by the occasional arroyo or irrigation pivot. But beneath your boots lies one of the most colossal and misunderstood sedimentary structures in the central United States, a megafan. And not just any mega fan. This one was built by the ancestral South Platte River, long before its modern incarnation meandered politely across eastern Colorado and into Nebraska. Back then, the river was a force of erosion and deposition that operated on a vastly different scale, one defined not by trickling streams, but by massive pulses of sediment, water, and geological momentum. Think of a megafan as an alluvial fan, but on steroids. Instead of a tidy cone of gravel spilling out from a mountain valley, a megafan stretches for tens of miles, often hundreds of feet thick, gradually tapering as it moves away from its source. The South Platte megafan system sprawls across huge swaths of the Nebraska Panhandle and adjacent areas, but its true size and structure only emerged in the past few decades, thanks to deep core sampling, high-resolution mapping, and a willingness to question old models. The layers tell a story of telescoping pulses, episodes of sedimentation that vary in intensity, size, and reach. Some pulses extend far into the eastern plains. Others are confined near the Rocky Mountain front. These aren't evenly stacked deposits. They're complex, overlapping lobes, built up through time like geologic breathing. Advance, retreat, fan out, repeat. But here's where it gets weird. Unlike the dramatic, steep alluvial fans seen in places like Death Valley or the Andes, the South Platte mega fans are almost invisible at the surface. Their slopes are so shallow, sometimes less than a meter per kilometer, that they read as flat to the naked eye. Only detailed topographic and subsurface analysis reveals their subtle form. But that form matters, because it's shaping everything above it. River behavior, soil moisture, groundwater flow, even the preservation or obliteration of archaeological sites. Which brings us to the mystery. What exactly did these megafans do to Nebraska's prehistoric record? Some scientists propose that the telescoping pulses of sediment deposition could have erased entire chapters of human and environmental history, burying early occupations, smoothing out floodplains, or misaligning stratigraphic sequences used to date other sites. In this view, the megafan acts like a geologic buffer, absorbing climatic signals from the Rockies and dulling them before they reach the interior. That means things like droughts, floods, or even glacial melt pulses might be underrepresented in the local sediment record, not because they didn't happen, but because the megafan filtered them. Others argue the opposite, that the fan preserved subtle environmental transitions by creating relatively stable surfaces where soil development, vegetation, and human occupation could take root. In that scenario, the fan isn't a buffer, it's a canvas. Either way, the implications are massive. If we misread the megafan, we risk misinterpreting the entire paleo landscape of the high plains. The fan is the foundation, but it may also be the editor, redacting or rewriting whatever was once written into the land. And this brings us to a river that didn't just ride on the megafan, it became it. The Platte River, that wide braided highway of sediment and water, has spent millions of years shifting channels, losing altitude, and carrying the Rockies to the Mississippi. one grain at a time. But where did it begin? And how many times did it have to reinvent itself before we gave it a name? 25. Platte River's long evolution. The Platte River today is a flat, sprawling ribbon of water braided across a shallow, sandy bed. It's famous for being wide, shallow, and difficult to navigate, a river you can walk across without getting your knees wet. It doesn't roar or slice through canyons. It sprawls, drifts, behaves more like a liquid plain than a river, confusing geologists and delighting sandhill cranes in equal measure. But the river we see now is only the latest incarnation of something much older, much more volatile, and far less settled. Because the Platte River has been reinventing itself for millions of years, shifting courses, changing channels, growing, shrinking, and twisting its way from a rocky newborn in the Tertiary to the shallow wanderer it is today. Its story is not just one of hydrology, but of geology, climate, and time itself. And like any long story, it has chapters we don't fully understand. Let's start with its family tree. The modern Platte River is born from the union of the North Platte and South Platte, which both rise in the Rocky Mountains and descend into the plains, like twin lifelines of sediment and snow melt. But during the Tertiary period, somewhere between 66 and 2.6 million years ago, there were no north and south branches. There were ancestral drainages, massive, unstructured, sediment-choked systems flowing eastward from a rising mountain front, cutting through what would become western Nebraska in unpredictable pulses. These ancestral rivers didn't follow modern routes. They flowed through different valleys, across different gradients, and into basins that no longer exist. Sometimes they coalesced into single systems. Other times they fanned out into deltas or megafans, building the alluvial platforms we now walk across without a second thought. In some places they flowed hundreds of feet above where the modern river sits today. The formation of the Ogallala Formation, the vast cap of Miocene, Pliocene gravels and sands that now underlies much of the high plains, is largely credited to these ancient river systems, including the Proto-Platte. The rivers carried quartzite, feldspar, and volcanic detritus from the Rockies and deposited them in thick, wedge-shaped layers across Nebraska. This was less a river system and more a continental conveyor belt, dragging the Rockies slowly eastward in sedimentary form. But something changed. Over time the flow weakened. The mountains began shedding less material. Climate shifted. The massive rivers shrank. Channels incised downward into their own deposits. The modern Platte emerged not as a continuation of those older rivers, but as a reduction, a miniature version of what once was. The broad, gravel-rich valleys left behind became the foundation for the shallow, braided riverbeds we see today. And yet, the Platte is still evolving. Over the last 10,000 years, during the Holocene, its channels have continued to migrate, splitting, rejoining, avulsing, cutting into old terraces and leaving behind oxbows and paleochannels. Archaeological sites along the Platte often show multiple episodes of occupation, separated by floodplain shifts that buried some layers while exposing others. This constant reinvention poses a challenge when we try to reconstruct prehistoric human movement or habitat changes or megafaunal migration routes. We're often doing it through the lens of a river that never sat still. And here's where the mystery sharpens. If the Platte has been in flux for millions of years, what signals has it erased? How many early camps, kill sites, or settlements were swept away, covered over, or diverted out of reach? How many stories did the river carry downstream before we could read them? That question echoes louder when we follow the Platte north into a zone where stability is even more of an illusion. The Sandhills, a sprawling dune sea with an origin story still very much under debate. Because while rivers carve and flow, the Sandhills do something stranger. They shift, they bury, and they rise. 26. Sandhills. Where did all that sand come from? There are landscapes that make sense. Rivers carve valleys. Glaciers gouge out basins. Wind shapes rock into arches. You can stand in those places, point to the landforms, and feel the logic. But then there are the Nebraska sandhills, and logic runs straight into a wall of dune grass and silence. Covering over 19,000 square miles, the Sandhills are the largest stabilized dune field in the Western Hemisphere. From space, they look like waves. From the ground, they feel like repetition. Endless ridges and swales, rising and falling in soft arcs that stretch to every horizon. They are not sand like beach sand. They're fine, dry, pale, and held together only by the thin armor of grass that grows just fast enough to keep them from moving. Usually. But here's the thing that still has geologists arguing over their coffee. Where did all that sand come from? This is not a small pile. The volume of sand in the sandhills is staggering. Estimates run into thousands of cubic kilometers. And yet, there's no obvious mountain range next door eroding fast enough to account for it. No ancient desert wind corridor speeding out dunes by the dozen. Just a quiet mystery rolling across a quarter of the state. The dominant theory has long been that the sandhills are the product of Pleistocene and Holocene wind-driven reworking of sediment, primarily from glacial outwash, as ice sheets advanced and retreated across the northern plains. Meltwater rivers carried enormous loads of sand, silt, and gravel down into what is now the central United States. As those rivers slowed, they dropped their sediment loads. Then the wind took over. When vegetation was sparse, either due to cold, arid climate or fire disturbance, the surface became vulnerable to deflation. Wind picked up the fine-grained material and blew it across the open plains, gradually building up dune fields. Over centuries, these dunes migrated, collided, and formed the massive, irregularly shaped ridges we now call the sandhills. That's the simplified version, but the details remain fiercely debated. Some researchers argue that the source of the sand wasn't just glacial outwash from the north, but also sediment derived from local tertiary and Cretaceous bedrock, ground down over millions of years by weathering and slow erosion. Others point to evidence of multiple dune-building episodes, suggesting that the sandhills are not a single geologic event, but a composite of distinct pulses, each tied to different climatic conditions. Still others raise a different possibility. That much of the sand came not from rivers at all, but from in-place weathering, the gradual breakdown of sandstone and siltstone formations exposed across the region during dry periods. In this model, the dunes are less imported than revealed. Blown into shape, yes, but not necessarily hauled in from afar. Geochemical analyses have yielded conflicting results. Some sand grains appear rounded and far-traveled, consistent with fluvial transport. Others are angular and local, suggesting minimal movement. The inconsistency fuels the debate. There's no single smoking gun, only a deep, granular uncertainty. What complicates this further is the sandhill's apparent stability. Despite being composed of material that should by all rights blow away at the first strong wind, the dunes are held in place by surprisingly fragile ecological balances. A dry year, a wildfire, a grazing collapse, any of these could destabilize parts of the system. And that's happened before, repeatedly. Because the question isn't just where did the sand come from, it's also how often has it moved. And when it does, it doesn't just reshape the landscape, it erases it. Campgrounds, valleys, lakes, everything. 27. When and how often did the dunes move? The sandhills look timeless, but they're not. Beneath the grass-covered ridges and windswept hollows lies a restless history of motion, burial, exposure, and reburial written in layers of shifting sand. To the casual observer, they seem permanent, anchored by native grasses and cradled by the Nebraska sky. But that illusion hides one of the most unnerving truths of the region. These dunes have moved and may move again. The central mystery isn't whether the sandhills migrated. That's well established. The real question is when, how often, and why. For decades, researchers assumed the dunes were an Ice Age legacy, formed during the last glacial maximum and more or less stabilized ever since. That tidy theory worked until geologists began slicing into the dune faces and pulling out core samples. What they found inside disrupted the whole story. Layered within the dunes are buried soils, paleosols, that form only when a dune sits still long enough for vegetation to take root and organic matter to accumulate. These soils are like geological bookmarks. They signal stability. But when a new layer of sand buries them, it means the system became active again. Dunes reactivated, vegetation lost, wind in charge. Using optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, dating, which measures the last time sand grains were exposed to sunlight, scientists have started building a timeline of dune activity. The results are anything but simple. The sandhills didn't just form once and then settle. They've activated multiple times, particularly during periods of climatic instability. One major reactivation occurred around 8,000 to 5,000 years ago, during the mid-Holocene altithermal, a time of increased aridity across the Great Plains. The dunes moved again around 1,000 years ago, coinciding with the medieval climate anomaly, a period marked by severe droughts across North America. In some areas, OSL dates show even more recent movement. As late as the 18th and 19th centuries, suggesting that parts of the sandhills were active well into the historic period. Wind didn't stop when the glaciers did. It just waited for the right ecological conditions, or the wrong ones. That's the catch. Dune movement is tied to thresholds, not just long-term climate trends. A region can receive enough precipitation on paper and still see dune activation if fire, grazing pressure, or land use disturb vegetation cover. Once that grass mat is breached, the underlying sand is vulnerable and the dunes begin to crawl again. From an archaeological perspective, this is a nightmare scenario. The sandhills have likely buried entire landscapes, early campsites, bison kill zones, trails, maybe even water management features. Unless those sites were used repeatedly or happened to erode out of a dune phase, they remain lost beneath meters of wind-blown sediment, their existence suggested only by anomalies in core samples or the occasional flake found in a blowout. And even when those sites are found, the movement of sand complicates interpretation. Did the people who left that hearth do so before or after the last major dune migration? Was their camp part of a larger settlement or a lonely outpost swallowed by shifting ground? We don't know. The sand tells us when it last moved, not what it covered or what it took with it. But what's even more mysterious is what the dunes created as they moved. Because in pushing forward, they sometimes blocked rivers and streams, turning flowing water into trapped basins, carving the land into strange new shapes and leaving behind paleolakes that lasted just long enough to be forgotten. 28. Dune-dammed paleo valleys Aizu and paleolakes. It sounds like a contradiction. Dunes, the very symbol of aridity and movement, responsible for the creation of lakes, still wet and deceptively peaceful. But in the sandhills of Nebraska, contradictions are the rule, not the exception. Here, water and sand have always been at odds, locked in a quiet tug of war that leaves behind geological puzzles in every valley. One of the most haunting of these puzzles, the dune-dammed paleolakes, bodies of water that form not from rainfall or groundwater alone, but from rivers and creeks being blocked by migrating dunes, like arteries clogged by drifting sediment. The basic mechanism seems simple. As dunes moved eastward, whether in response to climatic shifts, vegetation loss, or wind intensification, they occasionally intercepted existing drainages. The advancing walls of sand would dam small valleys and seasonal channels, trapping runoff and groundwater behind them. Over time, these impounded waters formed ephemeral lakes. Some were shallow basins. Others may have been deeper, longer-lived, even biologically rich. And then, often without warning, they vanished. What remains of them today isn't water. It's silence in the stratigraphy. Layers of laminated sealed clay and diatom-rich sediment hidden beneath the dunes, sometimes dozens of feet below the surface. These are the ghost lakes, former oases entombed by time and buried in sand. They don't show up on modern maps. They barely show up on the landscape. But to paleoclimatologists and geoarchaeologists, They are gold mines of lost time. Core samples taken from interdunal valleys across the sandhills have begun to reveal just how widespread these ancient lakes may have been. Some appear to have persisted for centuries, with multiple sediment layers suggesting seasonal cycling, aquatic vegetation, and faunal presence. Others were flash-in-the-pan events, short-lived bodies that formed during extreme climate events and disappeared just as quickly. Dating these features is difficult, often relying on radiocarbon tests of plant material, pollen assemblages, or diatoms preserved in the lakebed clays. But even where the timeline is fuzzy, the pattern is clear. Dune migration didn't just erase the past, it sometimes trapped it. And in doing so, created isolated ecosystems that might have attracted both animals and people. That's where the mystery deepens. A few Paleolake deposits have produced archaeological materials, flakes, bone fragments, and charcoal that hint at human activity around the lake margins. Were these long-term settlements, seasonal camps, hunting stations, watering points, or something more ceremonial, ephemeral landscapes that existed for a generation or two before vanishing beneath the next wave of sand? No one knows for sure. The archaeological record is, again, patchy, interrupted by sediment shifts and time gaps. A single flake found in a lakebed doesn't tell a story, but it suggests one. And the sheer number of dune-damp valleys, many still unmapped or untested, means that we're likely missing entire episodes of human adaptation to these unstable, hybrid environments, and the instability is key. These lakes weren't reliable. Their existence depended on a delicate balance between water availability, dune movement, and climate. A few degrees of warming, a year without rain or one, too many gusts of wind could tip the system back toward aridity and send the lakes back underground, where they waited to be found by future core samples and puzzle geologists. The sandhills hold these stories in layers of contradiction. Water trapped by sand, stability emerging from chaos, and life eked out in a landscape that changes when you're not looking. But if those paleo lakes rose and fell with the dunes, the next mystery comes not from movement, but from absence. A star-cutting absence in the soil, etched in rings, patterns, and tree scars that hint at a time when rain itself stopped coming. 29. Mega drought fingerprints. If the sandhills speak in whispers, then the droughts carved into their layers are more like a silence that echoes. Not a loud catastrophe, but the absence of water, absence of rain, absence of recovery. And when that absence stretches not for years but for centuries, it leaves behind something harder than stone, a mystery of endurance. Across Nebraska, and particularly in its ancient dune fields, lake beds, and river margins, researchers have uncovered subtle but striking evidence for a period of environmental stress, so profound it reshaped entire ecosystems and possibly human cultures. These are the mega droughts of the late Holocene, climatic events that lasted not one dry season or even one bad decade, but multiple human generations. The clearest signal comes from stratigraphy. In buried interdunal basins and paleolake cores, scientists find layers that show a sudden drop in organic material, a sharp shift in diatom populations, and mineral signatures consistent with evaporation outpacing precipitation. Some lake beds that had accumulated hundreds of years of seasonal silt growth suddenly reveal crusty, desiccated horizons, evidence that they dried up completely and stayed that way. One particularly well-documented episode dates to around 950 to 650 calibrated years before present, roughly 1000 to 1300 CE, a window that aligns with a much broader climate anomaly known across North America and beyond. In the southwest, it corresponds with the decline and migration of ancestral Puebloan societies. In the Great Plains, it shows up not as architectural ruins, but as gaps in occupation, in soil formation, in vegetation records. In Nebraska, the fingerprints of this mega drought are elusive but persistent. Dendrochronology, tree ring data from the surrounding region shows multi-decade periods of stunted growth in ancient wood. Pollen records indicate the spread of drought-tolerant grasses and the retreat of aquatic plant species. Charcoal concentrations fluctuate, possibly reflecting increased wildfire activity, either from lightning strikes on dry vegetation or human attempts to manage increasingly fragile landscapes. And then there's the archaeological wrinkle. Some indigenous sites across the Central Plains show abandonment or shifting occupation patterns during this time. Seasonal camps vanish from the record. Villages once nestled near consistent water sources seem to go dark. Trade goods from distant networks become rarer. Did people move, adapt, collapse? It's impossible to say for sure. What's unnerving is not that the drought happened, it's that it kept happening, in pulses and phases, like the climate itself had developed a cough. These weren't one-off anomalies, they were part of a larger pattern of Holocene climate variability that defied the climatic optimum narrative so many once believed. Worse still, it wasn't evenly distributed. Some regions experienced drying earlier, others later. Some paleo lakes dried completely, others just contracted. Precipitation patterns may have shifted eastward or become more seasonal, favoring winter snow over summer rain. The net effect, an unstable hydrological map with no clear boundaries between survivable and uninhabitable. That uncertainty, perhaps more than the drought itself, was the danger. You could build a village near a lake one year, and by the next generation, that lake might be a dusty hollow. A fertile grassland could become a sandblow in a decade. Rivers meandered or disappeared. The old maps, mental, ecological, cultural, became unreliable. Yet through all of this, life persisted. Not everywhere, not always, but in pockets. Around seeps, springs, and a certain kind of water body that shouldn't exist in a dune sea. And yet, there they are. Wetlands nestled between the dunes, like secrets the climate forgot to erase. 30. Interdune wetlands on a knife edge. In a region defined by sand motion and drought, water should not persist. And yet, in the heart of the Nebraska sandhills, beneath slopes of wind-blown quartz and between ridges that once wandered across the plains, lie pockets of stillness. Patches of open water, marshes, wet meadows, interdune wetlands clinging to the space between dunes like they were never supposed to be there in the first place. And in a way, they weren't, because by any reasonable geological measure, these wetlands should be temporary. They should vanish when the dunes move, dry out when the rain fails, drain away when the groundwater sinks. But many of them don't. Instead, they persist, some for thousands of years, quietly defying the odds and complicating our understanding of both climate resilience and landscape memory. The sandhills contain more than 1 million acres of wetlands, according to conservative estimates. That includes shallow lakes, marshes, peatlands, and wet meadows, scattered like aquatic freckles across a region otherwise dominated by arid grassland. These features aren't just modern quirks, they're geological survivors, remnants of ancient hydrologic regimes. And they're sustained by one of the most paradoxical systems in North America, the High Plains Aquifer. This aquifer lies beneath much of the central United States, but in the sandhills it sits unusually close to the surface. In many interdunal basins, the water table intersects the land, allowing groundwater to well up, especially in low spots between dunes. That's the secret. These wetlands aren't fed primarily by rain. They're fed from below, but that also makes them incredibly fragile, because the balance between surface elevation, aquifer pressure, and dune stability is razor thin. Just a few feet of change, whether from erosion, human water extraction, or a small shift in precipitation patterns, can flip a wetland from lush to lifeless. In core samples from several interdunal lake beds, scientists have found evidence of repeated wet-dry cycles. These wetlands didn't survive the Holocene as stable, unchanging oases. They fluctuated. They vanished and reappeared, sometimes within decades. Paleoecological data, especially from pollen and diatom analysis, reveal just how tightly coupled these wetlands were to climate shifts. During arid periods, open water shrank and vegetation gave way to xeric adapted grasses. During wetter periods, aquatic plants re-emerged and sedimentation patterns shifted. Some wetlands like Swan Lake and Hackberry Lake have yielded nearly continuous Holocene records, offering rare windows into how life clung to the margins even during climate chaos. And then there's the human element. Archaeological finds near interdunal wetlands suggest that indigenous peoples returned to these locations again and again, often during periods when surrounding regions were marginal or abandoned. Why? Because these wetlands offered a kind of reliability. Even if the surrounding dunes were dry and shifting, a low basin with groundwater access could still provide water, plant resources, migratory birds, and possibly fish. But the inverse is also true. These were not guarantees. These were gambles. To live in or near the sandhills wetlands was to live on a knife's edge, to adapt constantly to the rhythms of a system that could change without warning. Today, modern land use, aquifer drawdown, and climate instability pose new threats to these ancient ecosystems. What has survived for thousands of years may not survive the next 100. But the memory of those wetlands, their persistence, their role in shaping both ecology and culture, remains buried in sediment cores and echoed in scattered stone tools. And just east of this shifting sea of sand and water lies a river that doesn't quite belong either. Not hydrologically, not ecologically, not even geologically. Because at one strange crossroads in Nebraska, 6 different ecoregions collide, and the land starts speaking in multiple tongues at once. 31. Niobrara's geologic crossroads. If you follow the Niobrara River east from the dry highlands and deep cuts near Valentine, something strange begins to happen. The cliffs soften. The soil darkens. Cottonwoods cluster near the bends, and mixed grass prairie gives way to patches of forest. One moment it feels like Wyoming, the next like Iowa. Then suddenly you're walking through a pine-covered slope that feels borrowed from the Black Hills. The air changes, the light shifts. The map says you're still in Nebraska, but the land doesn't agree. This is the Niobrara Valley, and geologically speaking, it is an argument in progress. Nowhere else in the central United States do 6 distinct ecoregions collide in such a narrow corridor. Tallgrass prairie, mixed grass prairie, sandhills, eastern deciduous forest, northern boreal forest, and Rocky Mountain conifer forest all overlap here, in a patchwork of ecological voices speaking over one another. And what makes this convergence even stranger is that no one is exactly sure how it happened. At first glance, the explanation seems simple: microclimate. The steep north-facing slopes of the Niobrara River Canyon trap cold air and retain moisture, creating cooler, wetter refuges than the surrounding plains. In these pockets, species that shouldn't survive this far south, like paper birch, aspen, and ponderosa pine, not only survive, they thrive. But this doesn't just happen on one hillside. It happens throughout the valley, along the river in tributary draws, and across isolated ridges. Species from wildly different biomes cohabitate in a way that feels less like coexistence and more like a botanical glitch. Pines grow beside willows. Birch trees shade yucca. Orchids bloom in upland meadows, while cacti cling to sun-baked slopes nearby. And while modern ecology describes this as an ecotone, a transitional zone between ecosystems, the Niobrara doesn't behave like a transition. It behaves like a refuge, a climatic time capsule preserving species displaced by past environmental shifts. That's where the deep mystery begins. Paleobotanical studies suggest that some of the plant communities found here may be leftovers from the last glacial period. As the ice retreated and climates warmed, certain boreal and montane species migrated north or uphill, following their preferred conditions. But in the Niobrara Valley, some populations never left. The canyon's peculiar topography, steep, shaded, and moisture trapping, allowed them to hang on in microclimates that mimicked their ancestral homes. In that sense, the Niobrara is a living fossil bed, not of bones, but of ecosystems, a biological memory of ice age conditions, still breathing. But it's not just about trees and flowers. The valley's faunal record also reveals strange overlaps. Eastern and western bird species nesting in the same groves, mammals more common to boreal forests mingling with prairie dwellers. Amphibians and reptiles that typically don't share ranges coexist here. Each species is a clue to the region's fragmented climatic history, a history still being pieced together from pollen cores, faunal surveys and genetic studies. And then there's the human element, still largely understudied. Did ancient peoples recognize this ecological complexity? Did they use it, migrate through it, settle in it seasonally? The archaeological record is tantalizing but sparse. A few scatter sites, some tools, but no definitive narrative yet. Just a sense that this place, like the species within it, defies categorization. Geologically, the Niobrara is where east meets west, north meets south, and stability meets collision. It doesn't offer answers, it offers layers of climate, of species, of time. And speaking of layers, just downstream from this ecological crossroads lies one of Nebraska's most bizarre geological features. For over a century, it was believed to be a volcano. It smoked. It smelled like sulfur. It even caught fire. Only problem? It wasn't a volcano. It wasn't even alive. But it did burn from the inside out. 32. Ionia, volcano, not a volcano. On the bluffs above the Missouri River, where northeastern Nebraska leans into South Dakota and the landscape crumbles into soft yellow gullies, sits a hill with a reputation it didn't ask for. Locals once feared it. Travelers gawked at it. Scientists misunderstood it. It hissed. It smoked. It glowed. For decades, people called it the Ionia volcano, a geological misnomer wrapped in sulfur and mystery. Only one problem: it's not a volcano. It never erupted. It has no magma, no vent, no caldera. What it does have is a long history of confusion, a stubborn internal fire, and a geological mechanism that science still hasn't fully pinned down. The so-called Ionia volcano sits near the town of Newcastle, Nebraska, not far from the Missouri River floodplain. From a distance, it looks like an unremarkable clay hill, part of a larger formation known as the Pierre Shale, a marine deposit laid down during the late Cretaceous, when this region was the bottom of an inland sea. The rocks are soft, gray to yellow, and loaded with lignite, a low-grade brownish coal formed from compacted ancient plant matter. And that's the real story here. A burning coal seam, not a volcano. Somewhere beneath the surface of this hill, the lignite caught fire. No one's entirely sure when it started. Native oral histories mention the hill smoldering long before settlers arrived. The first written accounts from the 1830s describe rising smoke, foul smells, and even rumbling sounds coming from the earth. To the early observers, it looked like a small, sulfuric volcano, and in fairness, it acted like one. The bluff would emit heat. The ground would sometimes crack open. Vegetation died. Travelers reported finding warm soil in winter and occasionally pockets of flame. Local fear mixed with fascination. Some believed it was a gateway to the underworld. Others thought it was cursed. The government eventually surveyed it, determined there was no volcanic origin, and still didn't quite understand it. What we now know is that this feature, and others like it, is the result of spontaneous combustion of buried lignite. Under the right conditions, lignite seams can ignite themselves, especially when exposed to air through erosion or human activity. Once started, these fires can burn for decades or even centuries, slowly consuming the seam from within, leaving behind strange surface effects. But the Ionia site isn't just a curiosity. It's part of a broader phenomenon that continues to raise uncomfortable questions. Because Ionia isn't alone. Other smoking hills have been documented along the Missouri River and across the Great Plains, often in similar Cretaceous formations. Some burned briefly and went dark. Others have reignited. What triggers the combustion in the first place? That's still debated. Some cases are clearly due to lightning strikes, wildfires, or railroad sparks. But in more isolated pre-industrial settings like Ionia, it's not so clear. Could natural erosion have exposed the seam? Could microbial activity have created internal heat buildup? Could ancient fires or campfires have unintentionally lit the hill? The data is thin, and the fire, once begun, consumes its own evidence. And here's where things get even more speculative. Geologists now wonder how often such events occurred in prehistoric times, before written records, before towns, before maps. How many of these hills smoldered unnoticed? How many fires flared and died in the Badlands, unrecorded except in oral memory or myth? Could these features have influence where people camped or didn't? Did ancient travelers avoid the hot hills? Or were these places considered powerful, sacred, or dangerous? There's no definitive answer. The archaeological evidence near Ionia is minimal. But absence of proof isn't proof of absence. And it's worth remembering that a glowing, sulfurous hill would have been just as unsettling to a Paleo-Indian hunter as to a 19th century surveyor. Today, the Ionia site is no longer burning, at least not visibly. The soil has cooled, the smoke has faded, but the hill bears scars, cracked oxidized clay, red and yellow discoloration, hardened minerals where softer shell once was. It's a relic of chemical fire, not tectonic fury. But that doesn't make it any less strange. In fact, it may be stranger. Because at least volcanoes make sense. We know what magma is. We know what causes eruptions. But a hill that sets itself on fire, that sits in silence for years, then starts to burn from the inside out without warning. That feels personal. And yet, in its own way, it mirrors the behavior of another geological feature nearby. One that doesn't burn but buries. One that doesn't glow but instead goes quiet. And when it reawakens, it doesn't scream. It sifts. It reshapes. It turns open ground into a grave, because in Nebraska, even a waterhole can become a trap. And sometimes the difference between a gathering place and a mass death site is just a matter of timing. 33. From waterhole to bonebed, agate and ashfall analogues. Out on the high plains of western Nebraska, the sun carves hard shadows across a landscape that looks deceptively still. Short grass prairie, quiet arroyos, a few wind-lean trees. It feels like a place waiting for something to happen. But millions of years ago, this place wasn't waiting for anything, it was happening. And what happened here didn't just shape the land, it buried it. Nebraska is home to two of the most extraordinary fossil beds on Earth. Agate fossil beds and ashfall fossil beds. Separated by distance and separated by time, they share a haunting similarity. Both started as waterholes, sources of life, and both ended as bonebeds, packed with the preserved remains of animals that gathered there and never left. To understand how that happens, you have to think like a paleontologist with a long memory and a short supply of assumptions. Because these bonebeds don't tell straightforward stories. They aren't mass graves in the dramatic cinematic sense. There's no clear stampede, no volcanic fireball, no single moment of chaos. What you find instead is accumulation. Layers of life turn to death, turn to fossil, turn to puzzle. Let's start with agate fossil beds, located in the Niobrara River Valley, where a late Miocene grassland once stretched wide and warm, about 19 million years ago. This area hosted a seasonal watering hole frequented by herds of strange, now extinct mammals, Menoceras, tiny horned rhinos, Moropus, a clawed horse-like herbivore, and Daphoenodon, a dog-bear predator you wouldn't want to meet on a dry day. Over time, these animals died near the waterhole, some from drought, some perhaps from disease, others from predation. But the deaths didn't come all at once. The fossil record here suggests a drawn-out accumulation spanning several seasons, maybe even years. Carcasses were trampled, bones were weathered, some were scavenged, but they weren't carried away. They settled in low spots, were covered by silt during seasonal floods, and gradually entombed by time. What results is a taphonomic riddle. Is this a death trap, a persistent drought site, or just a high-traffic area that naturally preserved what other landscapes would have erased? Now shift eastward, both in space and in time, to ashfall fossil beds, where the story is similar and completely different. Here, in northeast Nebraska, about 12 million years ago, a volcanic eruption hundreds of miles away, likely from the Bruneau Garbage Caldera in Idaho, sent a vast plume of fine ash drifting across the plains. And one day, that ash began to fall. Slowly, relentlessly, it coated the land. It filled the air. And at a waterhole teeming with prehistoric rhinos, horses, and camels, it didn't stop. At first, the animals likely stayed close to the water seeking relief. But the ash built up in their lungs. Fine particles invaded their systems. Death came not from fire, but from suffocation and systemic collapse. Some fell near the water's edge, others farther out. What's eerie is how well preserved they are. Many skeletons lie articulated, undisturbed, almost peaceful. Some even show signs of having died in social groups, parents beside offspring, herds clustered tightly as they once would have stood alive. But here's the twist. Not all bone beds are this well preserved, and that's what makes ashfall unique. Unlike agate, where bones were scattered and scavenged, ashfall captures moments, positions, and even pathologies, with many skeletons showing signs of lung disease visible in abnormal bone growth. It's a death not of violence, but of endurance, bodies enduring too long, too close to what should have been a safe place. What ties agate and ashfall together is the irony of the waterhole. a symbol of life that becomes a ledger of death. And yet, not all such sites yield the same kind of record. Some are chaotic, others methodical. Some preserve only fragments, others entire herds. The reasons why are still under debate. Taphonomists, those who study how organisms become fossils, have to sift not just bones, but possibilities. Was the site buried quickly or slowly? Was it exposed to scavengers? Was the death event sudden or cumulative? Did predators contribute to the accumulation, or did drought set the trap long before the bones piled up? And maybe the biggest question: what role did landscape itself play in the story? Because neither agate nor ashfall would exist without the right geomorphological frame. Low basins that trapped carcasses, volcanic or fluvial sediments that buried them, a lack of post-depositional disturbance. In other words, it wasn't just what killed the animals, it was what preserved them. The uncomfortable part is this: we only see these stories because they survived, but they are not the rule. They are statistical miracles. Most death sites disappear. Most bones erode. Most waterholes that saw death left no trace. What we find are the rare survivors, accidents of geology that manage to hold on to a few days or years of life in deep time. And that's the final mystery. How many other agates and ashfalls once existed? How many waterholes became deathbeds but lacked just one condition? A ceiling layer, a basin edge, a quirk of wind. To fossilize what happened there. We'll never know, because the land forgets more than it remembers. And the stories we can tell from the past aren't the ones with the most drama. They're the ones that, for some reason or another, got stuck in the silence and stayed.